All right, so we're going to do Unit 4. We're going to talk about forms of ownership. We talked about the degree of ownership last chapter, or the estate. Now we're going to talk about the method in which you take ownership. And there are three ways that you take ownership. You take it as a sole person, you take it in some form of co-ownership, and then there's a trust way to take property. All right? So there are many different benefits of each one. We're going to talk about the differences between the one person and the co-ownerships. We're going to talk about several different types of co-ownerships. We'll also talk about some legal entities in here, like LLCs and partnerships and corporations and things like that. And we're going to identify some of the common issues. Now, the easiest way and the simplest way to own property is one person who owns the property. Now, it's going to sound funny because it's called severalty. All right? So everybody say several-ty. That's how it's pronounced. All right? While several sounds like many, that's not where the basis of the word comes from. The basis of the word severalty means to sever yourself from the rest of the world by being the sole owner of a property. So you own it in severalty. That is one person owning the property. That's the first way, that's the easiest one to recognize. The second way to own property is some form of co-ownership. Co-ownership, meaning two or more individuals. All right? We're going to talk about two major ways that co-owners own property. The first one I want to talk about is a thing called a tenant in common. You will hear it called TIC, T-I-C, tenants in common. I want you to think of a tenant in common like a pie. And the reason I want you to think of tenants in common like a pie, I'll explain in just a second. Now, there are several things that have to happen for TICs to be in place. The only thing that is required by all of the owners is that they get to be in possession of the property. That is the only, and it's called a unity. The only unity that these owners share is possession. They are allowed to own different amounts. It's called disproportional shares. One can own 5%, one can own 20, one can own 50, the other can own 14.83. That's called a disproportional share. Allowed. All right? But the disproportional share is called an undividable interest. This gets kind of confusing, so I want you to make sure you understand. I can own 10% and John own 90%. That's legal. But he cannot say that 90% of the shares are his and 10% of mine. No, they're an undividable interest. That means he owns 90% of all shares. All right? I own 10% of all of the shares. See what I'm saying? Suppose there's 100 shares. He can't take 90 of them and go, that's my 90%. No, it's not. You own 90% of all 100. I own 10% of all 100. It's an undividable, disproportional share. What, Miguel?
I was the same wording, but you just followed up with that.
Yeah. It's a disproportional, undividable interest. You can't take your 5 rooms and go home. No, you own 50% of everything.
So in other words, just because the percentage is divided doesn't mean the property is divided.
It's the interest that is divided, not the physical property. Maybe that's a better way to say it. It's an undividable share. He has 90% interest in everything, not 9 or 10 shares. That's allowed. We would each have our own title work. It would say something to the effect of Raymond Modulin as 10% owner in the property located at 12 Smith Street. John's would say Jonathan Bird as 90% owner in 12 Smith Street. So we each have our own different title work. And the reason that is, and this is why I want you to think of it like a pie, because each person can sell and trade their interest without contacting the others. Just like you can lift a piece of pie out and put another piece right in it.
So if there are two owners of a house or whatever, and it's sold, they can sell just their interest. So like if I own 50% of my house and I want to...
If you own it as a tenant in common. If you own your house and you want to sell 50%, it's got to be a tenant in common. So it's probably not going to be your primary residence, because we're going to get to, and you're married, by the way, so that's going to also have a problem. This would be like a professional office building, like this office building here. Maybe 8 of us own this building. I own 20%. I want to sell my interest. I'll just call John up and go, hey, let's sell. I'd sell it to him just like a regular piece of property. We'd go to closing, he'd get a title work, he'd give me the value for it, and I would give him his 20% interest. You other 7 people, I don't even need to tell you that's going on. All right? It's an undividable interest that I can sell. I can will it too. I die, it's in my will. My ex-wife owns a part of a building like this. Her grandfather died, he left her his interest in their medical office building. She has a tenant, part of a tenant in common, like 7.8% of this medical building. And we could get them at different times. I've owned mine for 10 years. John just bought in last week. All right? So a tenant in common only requires that we all have the right to possess it. None of the other things have to be in unity. We can have disproportional shares, we have different title work, we got them at different times, all of that. That's a tenant in common.
Would that be like a timeshare?
No, it's not like a timeshare. Timeshare is an ownership in one specific time. This is an ownership all the time, but just a portion of it. All right? Now, there's a second form of co-ownership called a joint tenant. And I want you to think of joint tenants like a glass of water. Now, don't be confused. This is not my same Freedom cup of water we talked about earlier. It's a different glass of water. The reason I want you to think of a different glass of water is because you can't take the center out without disturbing the whole thing. And therein lies the problem. All right? So for joint tenancy, you now have to have 4 unities. They have possession. They must have equal interests. They must have equal amounts of interest. So if there are 4 owners, how much do they own? 25%. Now, it's still an undividable interest. I can't take my 25% of the shares and leave. It's 25% of everything. But the 4 of us have an equal interest amount. You can no longer have a 90-10 split. If there are 2 of you, it's 50-50. You have to have equal interests. you all four would be named on one title work. Billy Joe Jim Bob, Jerry Jim Bob, Jeffy Jim Bob, and Johnny Jim Bob are the four grandkids that all got the farm in a will. It would name all four of them as joint tenants to the property located at 12 Smith Street. One title work, four names. Where tenants in common, you'd have four title works, each with the individual owner on it. And they all got it at the same time. Usually through an act of law, like a reading of a will or a marriage. Okay? The one that I like to do is the one I just told you. Grandfather dies. He leaves his four grandsons, joint tenants, the farm. So the title would say Jerry Jim Bob, Johnny Jim Bob, Jimmy Jim Bob, and Jeffy Jim Bob. They're from Arkansas, as you can tell. I know my family's from Arkansas. My family's neighbor, they have three kids. Two of the kids, true story, this is not a lie. One of the kids' name is Anthony and the other kid's name is Tony. Yeah. One kid's name is Anthony and the other kid's given name, his younger brother's given name is Tony. I thought my grandmother was teasing me when she introduced him to me. I'm like, really? Yep. One's Anthony James and the other's like Tony Robert. You guys know that's the same name, right? I didn't say that, but. So four grandkids, joint tenants, each one owns 25%, still undividable, but the interest is equal. They got it at the same time. So they all four would own 25%. Now, here's the biggest key difference between joint tenants. Joint tenants typically has this thing at the back called JTWRS, with right of survivorship. JTWRS stands for what would Jesus, no, those are different terms. Joint tenants with right of survivorship. Because here's what happens. When one of them dies, so you've got four owners, A, B, C, and D. When one of them dies, their portion is split amongst the survivors. So they owned 25%. Now, Jerry Jim Bob got caught in a threshing machine. That took a left turn. Now the three brothers own 33 1/3%. All right? Then Johnny Jim Bob was in a hunting accident. Now there's two brothers left. And then the last one mysteriously drank bad moonshine. There's one guy left. He owns 100%, and he owns it in. One owner owns it in severalty. He won the game. Now he gets to sell it. He gets to will it away or do whatever he wants. So the other three, while they're alive or when they pass, they can't will that property to their kids because it's right of survivorship. So that part of the farm stays in the family. And it just goes down till there's one left. And then when he died, now he can do with it what he wants. All right? So it's called joint tenants by right of survivorship. Well, I wonder what that is. So let's stop this because I want to talk about some more in just a second.